Blackadder was one of the most popular TV comedy series of the 1980s and continues to pull in audiences to this day. Rowan Atkinson plays the central character, Edmund Blackadder, as he travels through British history, ably, if that's the right word, assisted by his sidekick, Baldrick. His journey finally came to an end in the last episode in Blackadder Goes Forth, set in the First World War, when he and the rest of the cast go over the top into no man's land, and we're left to assume their fate. But several of you, including Tony, Will and Sarah, have contacted me to ask if Blackadder was actually based on a real person. Whilst the answer is that he was a fictional character, did you know that a real-life Captain Blackadder went forth across no man's land during the First World War? As did a Lieutenant George, a Captain Darling and a Private Baldrick. This is their story, and I hope you enjoy it. Rowan Atkinson's time traveller is fictitious, but the surname Blackadder really does exist. The Blackadders were a clan originally from the Scottish border area and were rewarded with lands due to their support of the Scottish kings against the English in the Middle Ages. A Blackadder and his men fought and died at the Battle of Flodden against the English in 1513. An offshoot of the family moved slightly further north to Fife, and their descendants included the leading Covenanter preacher John Blackadder in the 17th century and his son, also named John, who supported William III during the Jacobite Rising of 1689 and was to fight in the Duke of Marlborough's army at the Battle of Blenheim. No longer officially a clan, another notable Blackadder was Flight Lieutenant William Blackadder, who flew with 607 Squadron during the Battle of Britain. And then, of course, there's the fictitious Edmund Blackadder. Initially, he was actually styled Edmund the Blackadder during the first series, which was set during the Wars of the Roses, with his name referring to a snake rather than any Scottish connection. But he became Edmund Blackadder during the next series set in the court of Elizabeth I, where he first crosses swords with Lord Melchett. We then see him in Regency London and finally in Blackadder Goes Forth, where as Captain Edmund Blackadder he is fighting on the Western Front during the First World War. There he's joined by Lieutenant George, played by Hugh Laurie, and Private Baldrick, whilst crossing swords once again with General Melchett and his aide, Captain Darling. During this series, we see the character, played by Rowan Atkinson, desperately trying to find ways out of being killed, whilst delivering a wry commentary on the events around him. The fictional Captain Edmund Blackadder, played by Rowan Atkinson, is a bachelor, who's risen through the ranks, fighting at the Battle of the Somme, and, we assume from the very last episode, is killed advancing on the Germans during the final push. Of course, Blackadder, along with the other characters, are just fictional. But did you know there really was a Captain Blackadder who also fought at the Battle of the Somme? Captain Robert John Blackadder was, like Edmund, a bachelor, born near Dundee in Scotland in January 1884, making him 30 when the war broke out. Having studied Scottish law at University College Dundee, he then embarked on a career as a chartered accountant. This took him to London, where by the 1911 census he was residing in the Marylebone area of the city. It was also whilst he was living in London that he joined the recently established Territorial Army, the British Army Reserve, as a private in the 16th Queen's Westminster Rifles, part of the London Regiment. Formed in the 1860s as a volunteer force, by the time the real Blackadder was enlisting, the Queen's Westminster Rifles were the largest volunteer rifle battalion in London. With the declaration of war on the 4th of August 1914, the battalion were immediately mobilised, and Private Blackadder landed at Le Havre in November before heading to the front line. Just like the fictional character, Blackadder eventually rose from the ranks, gaining a commission in the Royal Garrison Artillery, a unit from his native Scotland. In March 1918, having been promoted to acting captain, he found himself commanding a unit under heavy fire at Bourons just outside Arras. He was awarded the Military Cross for successfully withdrawing his guns and stores whilst under heavy enemy bombardment. His citation read, "The successful withdrawal of all the guns and stores was largely due to his energy, coolness and resource." The decorated Captain Blackadder, unlike Rowan Atkinson's character, was not last seen going over the top, but instead survived the entire war on the Western Front, finishing with the rank of acting major. After the war he resumed his accounting career and returned to Marylebone in London and married Margaret Scott in 1920. Eventually he retired to Surrey and died near Guildford in 1968, aged 84. In the comedy series, Rowan Atkinson's fellow and junior officer is Lieutenant the Honourable George Colthurst St Barley. Played by Hugh Laurie, Lieutenant George is a parody of a young aristocratic officer, full of enthusiasm but with limited brains, despite the fact he's actually had a public school and Cambridge University education. Well, there was a real Lieutenant George who served on the Western Front too. Lieutenant Atherstone K. Durrance George was born on the 25th of March 1887, the son of Charlotte and Arthur George. His father came from a wealthy brewing family from Romsey, Hampshire, but had embarked on a career in banking. Young Atherstone was born in Brixton, South London, but when he was 5 the family moved to Bournemouth, where his father became the manager of the local branch of the National Provincial Bank, which, through a series of amalgamations, is now the NatWest. Arthur eventually left the bank and became the borough treasurer of Bournemouth. In 1908, he was a passenger on a runaway tram, which actually crashed, killing 7 people. The borough treasurer managed to escape with just a few bruises and scratches. By then, his son had finished his schooling in the town and had gone up to King's College, Cambridge, to study medicine. A keen sportsman, he rode for his college, but he found the academic rigour of his university course demotivating and left after just 1 year. Successfully passing the army exam, he was commissioned in the King's Liverpool Regiment in 1907. Described by his commanding officer as the best subaltern he had ever commanded, George was swiftly promoted to the rank of lieutenant in the 2nd Battalion, the Dorsetshire Regiment. 1914 would be a momentous year for Lieutenant Atherstone George. Firstly, in the April, he gained his pilot's certificate from the Royal Aero Club. Then, in the following month, his engagement to Marjorie Greenway, who lived near his grandparents in Romsey, was announced in the Tatler magazine. But before any wedding bells could be rung, war had broken out. Now serving with the 1st Battalion of the Dorsetshire Regiment, Atherstone was sent to France. Along with the rest of his battalion, he was swiftly into action at the battles of Mons, Le Cateau and the Marne. It was during that 3rd battle, just a month into the war, that Lieutenant George received a gunshot wound to his head and died on the 9th of September 1914, aged 27. There's a memorial to him inside Romsey Abbey. In the comedy series, Edmund Blackadder's bête noire is Captain Darling, played by Tim McInerney, the pen-pushing staff officer to General Melchett. Captain Kevin Darling is portrayed as an officer who tries not to get anywhere near the fighting, whilst ordering Blackadder and others into the danger. Eventually, however, he joins the rest of the cast, bar General Melchett, in going over the top in the final push. Before the whistle to advance sounds, he confides to Captain Blackadder that he'd hoped to get through the war, go back to life in Civvy Street, play cricket, marry his fiancée. He concludes, "Made a note in my diary on the way here." Simply says, "Bugger." Once more, there was a real Captain Darling fighting on the British Army on the Western Front. But far from the character portrayed by Tim McInerney, this Captain Darling was very much on the front line. Captain John Clive Darling was the son of the 1st Baron Darling, a prominent lawyer and politician. As a committed unionist, his father had taken Edward Carson into his barrister chambers when he moved from Ireland to England to practice law. Born in 1888 in the upmarket Hanover Square area of London, John Darling was educated at Eton before attending Sandhurst. He was commissioned in the 20th Hussars, a cavalry regiment, in 1906, and would remain with them for his entire 17-year military career. By the time the First World War had erupted, he'd been promoted to the rank of captain. But this Captain Darling, unlike the comedy character, was certainly not an HQ officer. Serving on the front line with his regiment throughout the war, he fought at the battles of Mons, Marne, Arnes and Ypres, amongst others. He was wounded in action, mentioned in dispatches, and was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, the DSO, in 1916. Surviving the war, John Darling married Eleanor Powell in 1918. They would have 2 children together. Retiring from the army in 1923 with the rank of major, he went on to write a book about his regiment, the 20th Hussars. He died in the New Forest area of Hampshire in 1933, aged just 45. And where would the Blackadder series have been without Tony Robinson's character of Baldrick? In the series set during the First World War, Blackadder goes forth, "Private Baldrick is the butt of Blackadder's scathing sarcasm and his schemes." From a humble background and unable to read, He, like the rest of the cast, is last seen going over the top in the final push in 1917. And once more, there really was a Private Baldrick serving in the British Army on the Western Front during World War I. Private James Baldrick was born near Drumrah, County Tyrone, Ireland in 1891. Rather like Tony Robinson's character, he too came from a humble background, an illegitimate child to his 17-year-old mother, Martha. There are some accounts that I've read that he spent some of his childhood in a workhouse, but what we do know is that in the 1901 census, when he was just 10, James was living with his mother and his younger sister and brother in Waterside, Derry. And in that same census, there is no record of a father being present. By the 1911 census, he was living in Omagh, where he was working as a shop porter. James Baldrick joined the Territorial Army, in his case the Inniskillen Fusiliers, early in 1914, and just like the real-life Blackadder, was called up when war was declared later that summer. His battalion, the 2nd Inniskillen Fusiliers, were one of the early contingents of the British Expeditionary Force to arrive in France. They fought at the Battle of La Château during the retreat from Mons at the end of August 1914. Just over 2 months into the war, Private James Baldrick was killed in action on the 20th of October 1914, aged 23. So, from the central characters of Blackadder Goes Forth, there really was a Captain Blackadder, Captain Darling, Lieutenant George, and a Private Baldrick serving on the Western Front. 2 were decorated for bravery, and 2 died for their country. The only one missing was Stephen Fry's character of General Melchett. Now, let's not forget that all these characters in the comedy series, both the one about the First World War and the others set elsewhere in history, were just fictional characters. They were never based on real people. It's just a coincidence that there are some real-life characters with those surnames. So I guess we shouldn't expect a General Melchett. But what if I told you there was a real General Blackadder serving in the First World War? Major General Charles Blackadder, no relation to Captain Robert, commanded troops on the Western Front, including an Indian brigade, and also played a leading role in the suppression of the Easter Rising in Dublin. So to finish off this story, let's explore the life and career of a Blackadder who became a general. Charles Blackadder was born on the 20th of September 1869 in Richmond, Surrey. His father was a teacher at various public schools, and his mother came from Alsace and Lorraine, the part of France occupied by Germany following the Franco-Prussian War. Consequently, throughout his life, Charles proudly declared himself to be half French. He attended the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst and was commissioned in 1888 in the 1st Battalion, the Leicestershire Regiment, which later after World War II became the Royal Leicestershire Regiment and is now part of the Royal Anglian Regiment. Shortly afterwards, his battalion was deployed to Bermuda, but his departure was delayed, as on the 2nd of October he was married in a registry office in Marylebone, London, which of course by pure and wonderful coincidence was the same area of London where Captain Robert Blackadder lived before the First World War. What makes this marriage ceremony slightly more interesting is that most officers didn't marry until well into their 30s, so he must have been in love. Or maybe there was another reason, because 6.5 months later his wife gave birth to a baby girl. Blackadder served with his regiment in Bermuda, Canada and Jamaica, rising to the rank of captain. In the late 1890s he was seconded to help raise the West Africa Frontier Force, before rejoining his regiment as commanding officer of the 1st Battalion Leicestershires in Natal Colony, South Africa. A week after he took command in October 1899, the Second Anglo-Boer War broke out. Blackadder was at the battles of Tulana Hill and the Siege of Ladysmith. After the war, he and the 1st Battalion were posted to India, and it was to India that he was to return in 1912 as commander of the 2nd Battalion Leicestershires. Upon the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the 2nd Leicestershires were mobilised as part of the 20th Garhwal Brigade of the 7th Meerut Division. This was a principally Indian Army division, but did include the Black Watch, the Seaforth Highlanders and the 2nd Leicesters. Landing in Marseille, they were rushed to the front line and on the 29th of October 1914 went into action. In January 1915 he was given the rank of temporary Brigadier General and took command of the entire Garhwal Brigade, consisting of his own battalion, 2 Indian battalions from the 39th Garhwal Rifles and also a battalion of Gurkhas. Under his command, the brigade fought at the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915, where 3 out of the 4 attacking battalions achieved their objectives, earning 2 Victoria Crosses and 9 Indian Orders of Merit for bravery. Following the Battle of Loos, the whole Meerut division was withdrawn from France to the Middle East in late 1915, and Blackadder was now transferred to command the 177th Brigade, a second-line territorial unit based back in England. In 1916, they and their commander were rushed to Dublin in Ireland to counter the Easter Rising. Due to his senior rank, Blackadder chaired a number of the court-martials of Republican rebel leaders, including that of Patrick Pearse. It seems that he had some sympathy with the rebels and, following the conviction of Pearse, wrote in his diary, "I've just done one of the hardest tasks I've ever had to do. I've had to condemn to death one of the finest characters I've ever come across. There must be something very wrong in the state of things that makes a man like that a rebel." Following Ireland, he was once again on the Western Front, this time commanding the 38th Welsh Division with the rank of Major General, participating in the Third Battle of Ypres, more often known as Passchendaele. In May 1918, Blackadder was replaced due to deteriorating health. He left the army and died of liver cancer and heart failure in April 1921. He's buried in Putney Vale Cemetery, London, and his regiment installed a memorial to him in Leicester Cathedral. And so we've come full circle. No General Melchett, but possibly even better, a real General Blackadder, to go alongside Captain Darling, Lieutenant George, Private Baldrick, and Captain Blackadder. Whilst Captain Edmund Blackadder was a fictional character, Blackadder is a real surname, and real Blackadders have played roles in both Scottish and British history, not just in the First World War, but over hundreds of years. Sometimes reality is even stranger and more fun than fiction. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story and it set you up for the New Year festivities. You can find out how to support my show in the description below, so check it out now. Or if you're in a rush, simply give this video a like. I'm Chris Green, the History Chap. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.